9:14 a.m., May 14th, 2026. Macon, Georgia. 4 unmarked vehicles pulled into the parking lot of the Bibb County School District Administration building and stopped. Engines off. No lights. Estimated victim age at disappearance, 8 years old. Years elapsed, 23. The warrant was drafted in 2003. It had never been served. Inside the building, a facilities manager named Gary Aiken was walking a school board safety inspection through the east corridor. He had a clipboard. He had a laminated badge. He had a name that nobody in Macon knew was not the name he was born with. Outside, 8 U.S. Marshals were already in position at the building's secondary exits. 2 plainclothes FBI agents had been sitting in the parking lot since 7:40 a.m. They had watched Aiken arrive in a grey Chevy Silverado at 8:03. They had watched him badge through the front entrance. They had been waiting. At 9:17 a.m., 4 marshals entered through the main lobby. They didn't announce themselves to the front desk. They had coordinated with district administration the previous afternoon. The principal's office had been briefed. The school board chair had been asked to keep Aiken on site until mid-morning, under the pretense that the inspection was running long. They found him between the gymnasium and the boiler room access. He was pointing at a ceiling junction when the lead marshal stepped in front of him. The 2 school board members walking the inspection stopped moving. Nobody said anything for about 2 seconds. Then the marshal said his name. His real name. Gary Allen Roark. Born October 3rd, 1971. Norfolk, Virginia. Aiken. Roark put the clipboard down slowly. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He was in handcuffs in under 30 seconds while the school board members stood against the hallway wall. The warrant being served had been drafted on September 9th, 2003, signed by a federal magistrate, sitting in a file in the Eastern District of Virginia for 23 years, 2 months, and 5 days. This is the story of Cassidy Rowell, 8 years old. Last seen March 7th, 2003. Norfolk Naval Station Family Housing, Norfolk, Virginia. And the man who walked free for 2 decades while her father filed the same request every year, asking someone, anyone, to finish what had been started. March of 2003 was a busy month at Norfolk Naval Station. The USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Group was preparing for deployment. Support personnel were rotating. The housing complexes surrounding the base were operating at capacity. Families in temporary quarters, maintenance crews cycling through, security checkpoints managing higher than average traffic. Cassidy Rowell lived in Building 14 of the Willoughby Bay housing cluster with her mother, Diane Rowell, and her younger brother, Marcus, who was 5. Her father, Petty Officer First Class, Dennis Rowell, had deployed to the Persian Gulf 11 days earlier, on February 24th. The USS Nashville had left port as part of the force build-up ahead of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Diane Rowell was managing 2 children, a full-time job at a base commissary, and a household alone. In her original 2003 statement, she described the routine as manageable. Building 14 had a central courtyard. Kids played outside after school. Neighbours watched out for each other. Not close, not personal, but present. On March 7th, 2003, Cassidy left Building 14 at approximately 3:40 p.m. School had ended at 2:55. She took the shuttle that ran between the base school and the housing cluster. The driver remembered her because she had been reading the entire ride. Most kids were loud. She wasn't. She got off at the Willoughby Bay stop. He watched her walk toward Building 14's courtyard entrance. She was never seen again. The initial response was standard. Base security was notified at 5:20 p.m. when Diane called after Cassidy didn't come in for dinner. A sweep of the housing cluster turned up nothing. Norfolk police was contacted at 6:45 p.m. A formal missing persons report was filed at 7:12 p.m. By 9 p.m., 24 personnel had walked the area. Dogs came the following morning. A Navy-wide notification went out. Local news picked it up by March 9th. And then things started going wrong in ways that were quiet and institutional, and that nobody would fully understand for over 20 years. The base maintenance logs for Building 14 and the surrounding structures showed that on March 7th, 2003, between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., 2 maintenance workers had been on site in the Willoughby Bay cluster. One was a base civilian employee. The other was a contracted worker from a maintenance firm the Navy used for rotating labour, a company called Tidewater Facility Services. The contracted worker was Gary Allen Roark. Roark had been assigned to a plumbing access job in the utility corridor between Buildings 12 and 14. His work order showed clock in at 1:55 p.m. and clock out at 4:30 p.m. His vehicle, a white Ford Econoline van with Tidewater facility markings, had been parked in the service lane running adjacent to Building 14's courtyard entrance. A neighbour named Patricia Sohn gave a statement on March 10th, 2003. She told investigators she had seen a man in a Tidewater facility uniform talking to a young girl in the courtyard at approximately 3:50 p.m. The girl matched Cassidy's description. The man was adult, white, medium build, wearing a grey uniform. She hadn't thought anything of it. Maintenance workers were a constant presence in the complex. That statement was logged. And then it was filed in the wrong folder. The Norfolk Police Department investigation and the NCIS investigation were running on parallel tracks with imperfect communication. The Sohn statement was logged under a miscategorized incident number, attached to a secondary case file rather than the primary missing persons file for Cassidy Rowell. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't suppressed. It was just in the wrong place. And nobody caught it for 18 months. Going through the public record from this period, one detail keeps nagging. Tidewater Facility Services employment records for Roark were requested by NCIS in April 2003. The records were provided. Roark's name appeared on them. His assignment to Willoughby Bay on March 7th appeared on them. A routine background check was run. Roark had no criminal record. The check came back clean. He was interviewed once, briefly, on March 19th, 2003. He stated he had completed his work order and left at approximately 4:30 p.m, that he hadn't seen anything unusual, hadn't spoken to any children. The interview lasted under 20 minutes. No follow-up questions about his specific movements within the complex. The Sohn statement, the one describing a Tidewater worker talking to a girl in the courtyard, was sitting in the wrong file and was never cross-referenced. Nobody connected them. Roark was cleared. Passively, by omission, by a misfiled piece of paper, but cleared. The evidence collection from Cassidy's disappearance included a physical forensic kit assembled from the area around Building 14's courtyard, soil samples, material recovered from the courtyard surface, a partial shoe impression near the utility corridor door, and biological material from the handle and door frame of the utility corridor entrance. That material was packaged, labelled, and transferred to the Virginia Department of Forensic Science Laboratory in Richmond. The package was received. The receipt was logged. And then, somewhere between intake and analysis, the processing was deferred. The laboratory in 2003 was managing a backlog that investigators would later describe in court documents as severe. The Rowell case material was placed in a queue and assigned a secondary priority classification. It was an active missing persons investigation, not yet a homicide, and the lab's prioritization protocol at the time weighted active criminal prosecutions over open missing persons cases. The deferral was noted internally. It was never communicated back to the investigating officers in any way that triggered action. No flag. No follow-up request. The kit sat in the queue. By September 2004, when an NCIS agent named Frank Carlisle filed an internal complaint about the Rowell case status, the kit had been in the Richmond laboratory for over a year and a half. Carlisle's complaint specifically named the unprocessed evidence kit and the 18-month gap. He sent it up his chain of command. He received a response indicating the matter would be reviewed. If that review occurred in any formal sense, it produced no documented outcome. The kit remained unprocessed. Carlisle filed a second complaint in February 2005, also acknowledged. No documented action followed. In the summer of 2005, the Richmond laboratory conducted an internal reorganisation of its backlog inventory. The Rowell evidence kit was transferred to long-term cold storage, not processed before transfer. The transfer was logged. The evidence was physically intact. It was simply never analysed. What stands out about this case is not any single failure. It's the sequence. The misfiled witness statement. The unprocessed evidence kit. The ignored internal complaint. None of these required malice. They required only the ordinary dysfunction of institutions under pressure, running parallel tracks that nobody had been assigned to actually connect. That's its own kind of accountability problem. Dennis Rowell received notification of his daughter's disappearance through official military channels while deployed in the Gulf. He couldn't return immediately. The logistics of emergency leave during active deployment created a 6-day delay before he was back in Norfolk. He arrived to an investigation that was active but already beginning to slow. He sat in the same rooms where detectives reviewed the same information in circles. He watched the case slow further as leads didn't develop, as tips came in and were exhausted, as the media cycle moved on. In April 2004, when the case was formally reclassified to inactive status by the Norfolk Police Department, Dennis Rowell began filing requests to reopen the investigation. His first formal request was submitted in writing that April. He filed the same request every year after that, sometimes twice. He documented every submission. He kept copies. He was a Navy petty officer. He understood bureaucratic procedure. He understood that documentation was protection. He filed anyway, knowing that most of those submissions would disappear into the same institutional structure that had already failed his daughter. Some years he received responses. Most years he didn't. Gary Allen Roark left Virginia in 2006. He resigned from Tidewater Facility Services in August of that year. His last known Norfolk address was vacated. He had no legal obligation to notify authorities of a change of address. No criminal record, no pending charges, no conditions of supervision. He was a free man. He left. Over the following years, a man using the name Gary Allen Aiken began building a life in Georgia. The name was close enough to his real name to feel natural, different enough to survive a casual check. He obtained a Georgia driver's license using documentation that investigators would later describe as exploiting gaps in identity verification common in the mid-2000s before federal Real ID standardization. He built an employment history. He held a series of facilities management positions across Macon and the surrounding Bibb County area. He was hired by the Bibb County School District in 2019. He received positive performance reviews. He was trusted with building access, safety protocols, the physical infrastructure of schools attended by children. He had been doing this for nearly 7 years when a routine database upload changed everything. In January 2026, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation uploaded a series of DNA profiles into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, as part of routine processing of a backlog of sexual assault cases from Raleigh. The cases had nothing to do with Cassidy Rowell. Nothing to do with Virginia. Nothing to do with any active federal investigation. One of the profiles produced a hit. Not a direct match. A familial match. A partial profile indicating a close biological relationship to genetic material already in the system. CODIS familial matching identifies not the person whose DNA was collected, but a biological relative. The hit pointed toward existing evidence material in the federal system. That material was the biological sample collected from the utility corridor doorframe at Building 14, Willoughby Bay Housing, Norfolk Naval Station, March 2003. The material had finally been processed. Not in 2003, not in 2004 or 2005 when Carlisle was filing complaints, but in 2019 as part of a federally mandated cold case evidence review that swept through state laboratory backlogs. By then, the technology to develop a usable profile from the degraded 16-year-old sample had advanced enough to produce a partial result. That partial profile had been entered into CODIS in late 2019. For 6 years, it had produced no match. Then the Raleigh upload happened. The partial profile from the utility corridor and the new Raleigh material showed a familial linkage consistent with a parent-child or sibling relationship. The Raleigh sample belonged to a man named Dominic Roark, arrested in November 2025 on an unrelated sexual assault charge in Wake County. He was 26 years old. He had a previous North Carolina address and a limited criminal history. He also had a father. The FBI's Child Exploitation Unit received the CODIS hit notification on January 14, 2026. The case was assigned to the Bureau's Cold Case Unit within the Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force, operating out of the Richmond Field Office. The lead agent was Special Agent Deborah Kaminsky, 19 years with the Bureau, 11 of them working cold case child exploitation. In those 11 years, she had never recognized an evidence file number from a previous iteration of her own career. She recognized this one because in 2004, as a junior analyst at the NCIS Liaison Office in Norfolk, she had been the person who typed up Frank Carlisle's first internal complaint, the one about the unprocessed evidence kit, and forwarded it for review. She had wondered, occasionally, over the years, what had happened to that case. She hadn't thought about it in some time. She now had to think about it very carefully. The familial match pointed to the father of Dominic Roark. FBI database cross-referencing identified the biological father as Gary Allen Roark, born October 3, 1971, last known address Norfolk, Virginia, 2006. No current address on file. No criminal record. No active warrants, except one. The original warrant issued September 9, 2003, Eastern District of Virginia, which had never been served. The warrant still existed. It had never been withdrawn. In September 2003, investigators had assembled enough probable cause to justify the document based on Roark's access and proximity, then filed it when the investigation stalled. Roark had moved beyond easy reach without anyone noticing he'd left, and the warrant had gone into a drawer with him. The warrant was 23 years old. It was still valid. Here's the part that seems strange on the surface, and yet makes sense once you understand how these documents work. A federal warrant doesn't expire. It doesn't age out. It sits until it's either served or formally withdrawn by the issuing court. This one had never been withdrawn because nobody had ever gone back to formally close the prosecution. The case went cold, but the document remained live in the court system. For 23 years, a piece of paper with Gary Roark's name on it existed, and nobody knew where he was to serve it. Kaminsky's team spent the next 4 months finding him. The investigative work from January through April 2026 was methodical and quiet. The task force couldn't risk alerting Roark. The familial DNA hit was solid, but building a prosecutable case meant assembling corroborating evidence that tied the utility corridor sample to Roark himself, not just to his biological relative. The first obstacle was identity. Gary Allen Roark hadn't appeared in any federal database under his real name since 2006. Running his name produced the old Virginia records, the old Tidewater employment, and then nothing. The team had to rebuild the trail from what he had left behind. Property records, tax filings under variations of the name, vehicle registration cross-references in southern states. The Georgia connection emerged in mid-February 2026 through a financial trace. A Gary A. Aiken in Macon, Georgia, had a federal tax record with a social security number that overlapped in 6 of 9 digits with Roark's original SSN, a pattern consistent with documentation fraud common in the mid-2000s. The overlap was flagged by an FBI forensic accountant on the task force, not conclusive, a direction. The team requested Georgia state records and conducted a covert records review. A driver's license photo of Gary Aiken, issued in Georgia in 2007, was compared against the 2003 NCIS interview photograph of Gary Roark. The comparison was run through the Bureau's facial recognition system and reviewed by a human analyst. The result was described in task force documentation as a high-confidence, consistent match. At that point, Kaminsky had a strong presumption. What she needed was confirmation, and to get it without alerting him. The collection operation ran in March 2026. The task force coordinated with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and obtained a covert collection order. An undercover GBI operative made contact with Aiken in a context that produced a discarded coffee cup. The cup was retrieved and submitted for analysis. The analysis came back April 3rd, 2026. The DNA profile from the coffee cup matched the biological material from the utility corridor door frame, not a familial match. A direct match. Gary Allen Aiken was Gary Allen Roark. The man standing in Bibb County School District hallways every day, managing building safety protocols, walking inspections, was the man whose DNA was on the door of the utility corridor where Cassidy Rowell was last seen in 2003. Consider Kaminsky's position for a moment. Not as a law enforcement professional, but as a person. She had been handed evidence in 2004 that was ignored. She had typed up a complaint about an unprocessed kit and watched it disappear into a bureaucratic review that produced nothing. She had spent 19 years building a career and working dozens of cases. And now she was in a Richmond field office looking at a DNA match that confirmed what the original investigators had suspected in 2003 and had never been able to prove because the kit had never been processed. She hasn't spoken publicly about that moment. The case file doesn't record her reaction. What it records is that she immediately began coordinating with the U.S. Marshals Service for warrant service and with the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecutorial review. The next step before arrest was location confirmation. The team suspected Cassidy's remains were in Virginia Beach. This was based on property records. Roark had owned a parcel of land in Virginia Beach from 2001 to 2008, a small lot with a residential structure that he sold before leaving Virginia. The property had changed hands twice since. The current owners had no knowledge of any prior history involving it. The task force couldn't search that property without a separate warrant. Obtaining that warrant without tipping off Roark required precise sequencing. Any search activity in Virginia could prompt him to flee or destroy evidence. The decision was made to arrest first. The warrant service was scheduled for May 14th, 2026. The Bibb County School District Safety Inspection calendar had been reviewed. District administration, cooperating under a confidentiality order, confirmed that Aiken was scheduled to conduct a building walk that day. His presence on site was guaranteed by his own work schedule. One thing nearly derailed the timing. A storm system had moved through central Georgia on May 12th, flooding 2 access roads near the district administration building and complicating the vehicle staging plan. The task force had to reroute the marshal vehicles and adjust the entry plan less than 48 hours before the scheduled arrest. The revised plan was finalised at 11 p.m. on May 13th. The operation on May 14th went as described at the opening of this story. Aiken, Roark, was taken into custody in the East Corridor at 9:17 a.m. without incident. He was transported to the Bibb County Detention Center for initial processing, then transferred to federal custody for transport to the Eastern District of Virginia. He was booked on the outstanding 2003 warrant. Additional charges were anticipated based on the ongoing investigation. At 11:30 a.m. on May 14, 2026, the Eastern District of Virginia obtained the property search warrant for the Virginia Beach parcel. A team from the FBI's Evidence Response Unit arrived that afternoon. The current owners had been notified that morning and asked to leave the premises for the day. The search began at approximately 2:15 p.m. The ERU team worked a systematic grid pattern of the rear lot, concentrating on an area identified in historical satellite imagery as having undergone ground disturbance between 2003 and 2006. The discovery was made at 4:47 p.m. Cassidy Rowell's remains were recovered from approximately 3 feet down in the rear section of the lot. The forensic anthropologist on site confirmed they were consistent with a child of the approximate age and size documented for Cassidy at the time of her disappearance. Full forensic identification through DNA comparison was completed in the weeks that followed. The identification was formally confirmed on May 28, 2026. She had been there for 23 years. Dennis Rowell was notified on May 14th at approximately 5:15 p.m. while the ERU team was still on site at the Virginia Beach property. The call was made by Deborah Kaminsky personally. He was at his home in Chesapeake, Virginia. He had retired from the Navy in 2018 after 31 years of service. He had continued filing his annual requests to reopen the case through retirement. His most recent request had been submitted in October 2025. The conversation between Kaminsky and Dennis Rowell was not recorded and has not been described publicly by either party. What is part of the record is that Dennis Rowell arrived at the Virginia Beach property at approximately 7 p.m. He stood outside the police line and did not speak to reporters. He was accompanied by his son Marcus, now 28, and by his sister, who had driven from Richmond. They stood there for some time. Then they left. Here's a take that may draw disagreement, but it needs to be said. The failure in this case was not dramatic. It wasn't corruption, malice, or a deliberate cover-up. It was a paper filed in the wrong folder, a kit placed in a queue and never pulled out, a complaint received and not acted on, a warrant that sat in a court system for 23 years because nobody went back to either serve it or close it. That is not an exoneration of the system. It is an indictment of it. Because the same mundane institutional failures that let this case fall through the cracks in 2003 almost certainly exist right now. In active cases, in laboratories with backlogs, in filing systems where a wrong folder can cost 2 decades. Frank Carlisle, the NCIS agent who filed complaints in 2004 and 2005, retired in 2009. He was not asked to testify. He was not formally recognised in connection with the case resolution. He hasn't spoken publicly. The original Norfolk investigators haven't been identified in connection with the misfiled Soane statement or the unprocessed evidence kit. No administrative review of those failures has been announced by either the Norfolk Police Department or NCIS. Nobody has been held accountable for the 23-year delay. What do you think? Did the system fail Cassidy Rowell through individual negligence? Or is this what happens when no single person is responsible for connecting the dots? Leave that in the comments. It's not a rhetorical question. Gary Allen Roark was arraigned in the Eastern District of Virginia on May 19, 2026. He entered no plea at arraignment. Federal charges included kidnapping resulting in death. Virginia state charges for first-degree murder were filed concurrently by the Commonwealth of Virginia's Attorney General's office on May 21st. The coordination between federal and state prosecution was described as ongoing. Roark has not made public statements. His appointed defense counsel has not made public statements beyond routine procedural filings. No trial date has been set as of the current date. The Bibb County School District issued a statement on May 14th confirming the arrest and expressing cooperation with federal authorities. The statement noted that no current students or staff were believed to have been at risk. It offered no comment on how a man operating under a false identity had passed the district's background check process. The district conducted a review of its hiring procedures, details of which have not been publicly released. This is the detail that stuck with me from the entire case record. Roark had passed a standard background check when hired by the Bibb County School District in 2019. It came back clean because Gary Allen Aiken had no criminal record. The check was run against the name on the application, not against a biometric profile. Gary Allen Roark's name didn't appear because Roark wasn't applying. Aiken was. The system found nothing because it was looking for the wrong person. There is no evidence the district did anything procedurally wrong by the standards they were operating under. There is also no evidence those standards were sufficient. The Tidewater Facility Services Company that employed Roark in 2003 closed operations in 2011. The maintenance contracts it held with the Navy's housing operations were transferred to other vendors. No former Tidewater employees have been publicly implicated in the Rowell case. Patricia Soane, who gave the original 2003 witness statement describing a Tidewater worker speaking with a girl matching Cassidy's description, could not be located for comment. Her statement, the one misfiled in 2003, sitting in the wrong folder for 2 decades, is now part of the prosecution's exhibit list. The warrant served on May 14, 2026, was the same document signed by a federal magistrate on September 9, 2003. It had been sitting in Eastern District Court records in paper form, scanned into the electronic system as part of a document digitization initiative in 2016, theoretically findable by anyone who knew to look under the correct case designation. For 23 years, nobody had looked, because the case had gone cold and the warrant had been associated with an investigation that had no active traction. One detail from the 4-month investigation, Roark had not stayed entirely hidden. Public records showed he had attended professional certification courses in facilities management under the Aiken name. He had joined a local Macon trade association. He had lived an ordinary, visible life. Not the behaviour of someone who thought active investigators were after him. He likely believed, correctly for 23 years, that the case had died. That no one was coming. He was not wrong about the case. He was wrong about the DNA. CODIS familial matching expands the reach of cold case evidence without requiring anyone to actively investigate the original case. Roark didn't end up in a database. His son did. And that connection, a single familial hit from an unrelated assault case in Raleigh, was enough to pull a 2003 evidence sample out of archival storage and run it against a profile that hadn't existed when the original crime was committed. The system that failed in 2003 was human, institutional, bureaucratic. The system that caught him in 2026 was genetic. Dennis Rowell filed 22 annual requests to reopen his daughter's case between 2004 and 2025. 22 submissions. 22 years of formal correspondence to institutions that had lost his daughter's witness statement, left her evidence kit on a shelf, and filed a warrant they never served. Whether this represents justice, or only its technical occurrence, is not something the court system is designed to answer. If you've followed this channel, we cover cases where the system works, and cases where it barely works, and cases where it doesn't. This one doesn't fit a clean category. The warrant was served. The remains were found. A man faces trial. None of that erases 23 years. Will cases like this, cold warrants sitting in federal court systems, unserved, technically valid, start being systematically reviewed now that CODIS familial matching has proven its reach? Comment why yes if you think this triggers a national cold case review. Comment no if you think this stays an exception. We read every one. The Rowell case is part of a larger review of Eastern District of Virginia cold case warrant inventory that Kaminsky's task force requested in May 2026. The scope of that review. How many warrants are sitting in similar status? How many evidence kits from the same era remain unprocessed? How many Patricia Sohn statements are sitting in wrong folders across the country? Is not yet publicly documented. The demand for accountability in this case exists. The mechanism for delivering it, inside the institutions that created the failure, remains unclear. Cassidy Rowell was 8 years old. She liked to read on the bus. She got off at Willoughby Bay on a Friday afternoon in March 2003. She was never supposed to disappear into 23 years of institutional delay. She did. Her father knew where the file was. He filed requests every year. He kept copies. He never stopped. The file was closed. The warrant never was. On May 14th, 2026, it was finally served. If this case matters to you, if the intersection of cold case, DNA technology, and institutional failure is something you want to follow, subscribe to Cold Warrant. New cases drop every week. And if you've heard of a similar unserved warrant in your area, leave it in the comments. These stories don't always make the national news. Sometimes the only way they surface is because someone who knew about them says something. The prosecution of Gary Allen Roark is ongoing. No verdict has been issued. The evidence kits from the same 2003, 2005 batch at the Richmond laboratory have not been publicly audited for similar processing gaps. The Sohn statement misfiling has not resulted in any documented procedural reform at the Norfolk Police Department or NCIS. The network of institutional failure that allowed this case to stall is not dismantled. It is the standard operating environment of underfunded cold case units across every jurisdiction in the country. The DNA caught him. Everything else is still where it was.